as Master of Ceremonies for our program this evening. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the West Roxbury-Rosendale chapter of the John Birch Society. If you will all rise, we will open the meeting with an invocation given by Bill. Please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance.
God bless Ambassador Funderburk and the men and women of the John Birch Society as they lead the way in the battle against the forces from within and without and outside the government that are working to destroy our God-given rights. God bless the men and women in the audience tonight who have come seeking knowledge and information. For we know that only an informed people can hope to retain and be worthy of that freedom with which the United States of America has been blessed. God bless our efforts in seeking to retain our God-given rights and informing others in hopes of bringing about less government, more individual responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Amen.
Amen. Let's all put our hands over our hearts and face the flag. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. I will now call on Harold Shurtleff, the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society, to introduce our featured speaker, Mr. Funderburk. Now, before I introduce the ambassador, I'd like to bring up Senator Hedlund. Senator Hedlund sponsored a resolution in the Massachusetts State Senate this afternoon honoring David Funderburk, and Mr. Funderburk spoke in front of the State Senate.
Thank you. I was excited to learn that my good friend Ambassador Funderburk was going to be in town today, and we were fortunate enough that we were in session today and had him address the State Senate today, and I was proud to sponsor a resolution which we were able to get through today honoring Ambassador Funderburk, and I'd like to take a moment to read this to you. Commonwealth of Massachusetts resolutions honoring David Funderburk. Whereas David Funderburk was appointed the United States Ambassador to Romania by President Ronald Reagan in 1981, and whereas during his tenure David Funderburk was an active and outspoken opponent of the communist regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, which terrorized the Romanian people for decades, and whereas Ambassador David Funderburk opposed exporting technologically advanced equipment to the government of Romania because of the atrocities committed by this regime, and because of his belief that positive action by the United States would contribute to the elimination of these atrocities. And whereas Ambassador Funderburk disagreed with and consistently challenged the conciliatory approach taken by the State Department of the United States toward Ceausescu, which eventually led to his resignation as the United States Ambassador to Romania. And whereas recent events, including the popular revolt which overthrew the Ceausescu government, reflect most positively on the convictions of Mr. David Funderburk, now therefore be it resolved that the Massachusetts Senate congratulates David Funderburk for his leadership and for his actions which demonstrated the courage of his convictions during his tenure as ambassador to Romania. And be it further resolved that a copy of these resolutions be transmitted forthwith by the clerk of the Senate to David Funderburk, signed by myself and offered by myself, Senator Robert Hedlund, and signed also by the President of the Senate, William M. Bolger. So I'd like to make this presentation to the ambassador and welcome him back to the Boston area. I think it's been about a year since he fortunate enough to see the ambassador speak over at BU last year, and he's as good as he was that night. You're in for a treat tonight, so enjoy the talk.
We have a problem tonight. It looks like we're running out of chairs. These are the kind of problems that I really like. There are but few times in history when a person of extraordinary character steps from behind the drawn curtains of foreign policy to tell the truth. Many of you may know about the first person to do so, Arthur Bliss Lane, the former ambassador to Poland. He spoke honestly about the U.S. betrayal of Poland, which he documented in his book, I Saw Poland Betrayed, and we do have copies back there.
The second such person is with us tonight. From 1981 to 1985, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Romania, having been appointed by President Reagan. Our speaker resigned from the ambassadorship to speak out against U.S. foreign policy, collaboration with communist dictators. He has addressed hundreds of audiences across the country, warning of the external communist threat and of the insider betrayal of America. He has been featured on national TV and radio and has written several books on the subject. Pinstripes and Reds, If the Blind Lead the Blind, and Betrayal of America. And incidentally, we have the books available, Betrayal of America, as I mentioned, and the ambassador will be able to autograph some tonight. Our speaker received Fulbright and IREX fellowships for study in Romania, served as a U.S. Information Agency officer, and received his PhD in History and International Studies from the University of South Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a great man who has the courage, integrity, and patriotism to tell it as it is, Ambassador David Funderburk.
Thank you very much, Hal, for those very kind words. Fellow Americans, I would like to pay tribute to Senator Bob Hedlund, a good friend of mine, for the nice gesture, the honor that he bestowed on me today. It was very nice to be touring historic Boston, to be surrounded in the state Senate by pictures and monuments of our founding fathers. It recalls their courage, their special sacrifices, their faith, which those people in Eastern Europe, where I lived for over 6 years, those who love freedom, look to us and to you as their model. The least we can do is be true to that distinctive heritage and not let a Studs or a Frank or a Kennedy or a Flynn or even a Weld take it away. Amen. All right. I am here because our freedoms are in danger, our constitutional republic and our way of life are more threatened today than ever before, and more so by our own political leaders than ever before, not just the external enemy or adversary. I'm here because time is running out before America wakes up to a new world order. I'm here because I have children. I'm here because I lived in the communist world for over 6 years. I witnessed Big Brother and big government up close and personal. And I'm here because I support the educational efforts of the John Birch Society. To give you some of my background and tell you where I'm coming from, what has happened since I resigned from the position. I was living just a few years ago in a 24-room mansion with a heated indoor swimming pool, gardeners, maids, cooks, butlers, a chauffeured limousine. We had a KGB colonel as the driver for this armored limousine with the American flag on one side, the State Department flag on the other. We had the best food in the world flown in from West Germany and the United States to this elitist compound where we were living like royalty. We could send our children to the best private academies and schools in Western Europe and the United States. The salary at that time was $75,000, more than $50,000 in addition in fringe benefits. Today it's about $200,000 total. I could have stayed on in that position for another 4 or 5 years throughout the Reagan term. I had lived, however, in Eastern Europe and in Romania on 4 previous occasions, often in the shoes of the people with families and people there who had suffered political and religious persecution, who had been in jail, and who paid a heavy price for their beliefs. So, if you have a conscience, it bothers you to go day after day to luncheon, dinner, reception, cocktail parties, and watch decadent diplomats click glasses with communists from China and the Soviet Union and Romania. I got tired of reading about the horrors of Nicolae Ceausescu and other communist regimes. I reported these to Washington, and they were ignored. I was circumvented. I met George Bush in his office in the White House. I met Ronald Reagan. George Bush and Barbara Bush came to Romania. Betty and I hosted them there. I briefed him on Air Force 2, flying from Belgrade, Yugoslavia to Bucharest, Romania. And I said, you're aware, of course, that every week pastors and priests are being killed by this monster. You're aware that every week churches are being destroyed, drugs, terror, military armaments are being exported around the world, and you have bizarre policies which are repressive to all the people in this country who hate this man. So we shouldn't be in bed with him any more than we should any other communist dictator. So for God's sakes, when you go in to meet Ceausescu, George Herbert Walker Bush, please put down a marker for human rights, put down a marker for everything that we stand for in this country, our principles, our values, our heritage, and tell him that we will not continue to grant most favored nation treaty status and continue to give aid and assistance to anybody that carries out policies as you do. Unfortunately, George Bush had been briefed before that time by the State Department, the NSC, and other people in the establishment. He proceeded to praise Ceausescu and to assure this monster you've seen on television, Christmas 1989, who was executed. But, you know, the world should have known about this long before. If the media had cared, the world hasn't known about a lot of horrors and atrocities that have taken place in Eastern Europe and Communist China and other places. But the sad thing was that George Bush apparently was much more concerned about protecting the interest of some friends who had financial investments and were undertaking trade with Communist Romania at that time, in the same way that he's more interested with the 400 American corporate, bank, and business heads who are dealing with the Communist Chinese than he is with the thousands of students who were slaughtered in Tiananmen Square. So it didn't come as a surprise to me to see the policy of our president, our administration, our State Department, vis-a-vis Gorbachev, vis-a-vis Deng Xiaoping. It was the same policy I witnessed firsthand, vis-a-vis a monster hated by virtually everybody in the country of Romania. So I gave up this mansion and this plush life and perhaps a track to other jobs in the establishment. I wrote a book and I tried to expose this policy of the Bush administration. Even after writing this book, it was made very difficult for me to ever try to get it published. I had to submit the manuscript to the U.S. State Department, the Pinstripes and Reds book, which I wrote initially describing my experiences caught between the State Department and the communists in Romania and in Eastern Europe. And they sat on the book and they wouldn't give me permission to print the book. So eventually, I had to hire an attorney who explained to the State Department that I had some rights as a citizen. And so they didn't block it. They never gave me permission, actually, to go ahead and to print the book. Then I was recruited to run for the United States Senate. And when I ran for the United States Senate, the State Department, with the knowledge of George Bush, trotted out to the major media, both in our state and nationwide, 24 spokesmen, unnamed spokesmen for the State Department who took pot shots at me. And what they said essentially was, well, the problem with Funderburk was that he was one of those flag-waving patriots. You know, at the 4th of July, we had several thousand people at the American residence, and we flew the American flag and we played the national anthem. That was America's territory there, and I thought that's what the heck I was sent there to do. And so that's what we did. And that's one reason that I was criticized in the major newspapers, because I was playing the national anthem and flying the flag. I've had subsequent problems in terms of telephone calls from the Bush White House with regard to things that I mentioned in Pinstripes and Reds. Questions being, are you going to continue to write about this particular case? Do you know any more about it? Are you going to bring it out during the election? This was in 1988. At that time, I didn't have the total documentation, which I do have now, and much of it is in Betrayal of America. And it was this, that in all the years that George Bush was dealing with communist Romania, and you could ditto this for most of the other communist countries around the world, he only lifted a finger one time, as far as I know, for any immigration case, any human rights case in that whole country, in that whole part of the world. And the case that he raised or showed interest in just happened to be someone who married into the family of former liberal Democrat governor of Pennsylvania, Milton Schaaf. And that family happened to be, according to an eyewitness who was beaten and who was in jail in the Gulag in Romania for many, many years, those family members that George Bush lifted a finger for to get out included a co-founder of the Communist Party of Romania, the party that helped create Ceausescu, and the man known throughout the Gulag system in Romania as the jailer who beat the political and religious prisoners and dissidents. And so one of these dissidents, who is a very good friend of mine who lives in Washington, said and wrote, of all the people in that country, you would think that America would be trying to save and to assist somebody who stood for freedom, religious or political, but not the one who was killing and crushing those who stood for it. So these are just a few of the experiences that I've had in terms of George Bush and what he was doing. I wanted to divide this talk into two parts. One is that, of course, caution and skepticism should be the order of the day, not euphoria with regard to what's happening in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And the second would be how it is that America's establishment, America's leaders, America's insiders, always put the interest of themselves or communist bosses ahead of the interest of those suffering under communism, striving for freedom, and ahead of the interest of the American people. With regard to Soviet communism, the Soviets have done a pretty good job in this country, with the help of the major media, of convincing most Americans that communism is dead. The Soviet Union now has democracy. Gorbachev is a Democrat and a reformer. The Central Soviet government is no more. The government is with the republics today. That's where the power is. So it was very interesting for me to read in the Boston Herald today, the Wall Street Journal yesterday, that the 12 republics of the Soviet Union now, excluding the Baltic nations, declared that they were signing a treaty for an economic union. And this would also include a union which would cover the whole ground of coordination of activities from communications to defense. In other words, you see what has taken place is that on one day we were told there was no longer a union, and they all had declared independence except for one or two republics. So the independence was with the republics. So today we're seeing again, here's a union again. So there was a union initially, then there were republics, and now we're back to the union again. Well, no, I'm afraid I would have to say that there's been the union there all along. And of course, there was no real problem to let, to some extent, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia go. They make up less than 1% of the territory of the Soviet Union. And they're not completely gone in the sense that Soviet troops, over 300,000, by the way, are going to be stationed there right into 1994. So if they gain independence, they won't gain sovereignty. It'll be more along the lines of what has taken place in Finland, with the Soviets having a veto. And of course, they were the issue that seemed to get America's attention much more than the other ones. Also, part of this projection has been that the KGB is being transformed into a harmless organization. We don't have to worry about the KGB anymore. It's under new reform leadership appointed by Gorbachev himself. Also, we've been told that the Soviet people may starve this winter. So we've got to rush over there with as much aid as possible to prevent this starvation. Well, a couple of points on this. Every report that's credible that I've been able to see, whether it's from the former Undersecretary of Agriculture or the International Council of Wheat in London in last week, have stated that there is no danger of massive starvation inside the Soviet Union this winter. I mean, this is all if we consider that our aid would go to the people who need it anyway, which of course it does not. It never has. So that the facts show, and even the Wall Street Journal reported last week, that of the $1.5 billion that we sent for food aid last winter, over 2/3 of it went not to any people on the verge of starvation, but to black marketeers and members of the Communist Party nomenclatura. That's where it went. So here we are in recession. Taxes going up everywhere, in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and all over the country. And the Soviet Union has a debt to Western creditors of $68 billion, which will never be repaid to anybody, and we're talking about sending a massive infusion of assistance into the Soviets, a grand bargain, a massive bailout, starting with food aid to people who don't need the food aid and who aren't going to get it. And when I was in Romania, this was always the argument of the major media. Well, the poor Romanians are starving. They need our help. The poor Poles are starving. The poor Chinese are starving. That's why we have to have MFN. We can't break off ties with these people. The money goes to the Deng Xiaopings and the Nicolae Ceausescus and the Mikhail Gorbachevs and their gangs. The money doesn't go to the people who seek freedom or anything else that we stand for or believe in. Well, we don't have to be conned again and again. Before we close the books on the Soviet Union or a Soviet threat, let's consider a few things. Many of you are very much aware of these already, but I did want to add some ammunition for those people who are not familiar with all of these things. As Gorbachev returned from the Crimea following the so-called coup, he said, "I am still a communist." Or you can read, he said, "I am still a socialist," whatever you want to read there. On the ABC National Town Hall meeting, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin said, "We are atheists." Well, that must have been a shock to half the Americans who've been reading all these years that Gorbachev was really a closet baptized Christian. And seeing Yeltsin walk into Orthodox churches inside the Soviet Union. They even admitted, figuring nobody cared anyway in the United States, that they were atheists now. That bothers me, I should say. Gorbachev's new reform chief, Vadim Bakatin, said he was not going to release the names of any agents of the KGB. They were not going to release intelligence files on any of these people. And instead, as a matter of fact, he has kept on virtually all of the same KGB operatives. KGB, by the way, even at the admission of the Soviets, has killed over 20 million people in the Soviet Union. And today it has more uniformed troops than the U.S. Marines, and there are more KGB agents in the city of Moscow alone than all the CIA and FBI agents or officials worldwide, just to give you an example of it. So does anyone seriously believe that the new Yeltsin-Gorbachev reform, quote, chief of the KGB is going to open the real files and tell the truth about the attempted assassination of the Pope, Lee Harvey Oswald, what Alger Hiss told the Soviets, the true story of KAL-007 and the fate of Larry McDonald, high-level U.S. spies who were never caught, what senior U.S. and Western politicians were on the Kremlin's payroll? You think we're ever going to find out any of these things from this new reformed KGB? I wouldn't think so. Whatever comes out of there will be something that comes out of the Department of Disinformation of the KGB, which is one of their largest departments. You're aware that this peaceful Peace Prize winner, Gorbachev, just a few weeks ago, redeployed hundreds of mobile nuclear missiles, SS-25s, throughout the Soviet Union. This is the disarming pacifist Soviets. The Soviet military, with 4 million soldiers, is more than double the size of the U.S. military. Under Gorbachev, in the last year, the defense spending has risen from 26% to 36% of the GNP. Ours has decreased to below 5% of our GNP. This is under the peaceful Gorbachev. Gorbachev, the good, the great, the liberal, the Democrat, the reformer, you know, all of these things that he's projected to be. So since 1988, the Soviets have built 415 new ICBMs to our 33, 29 warships to our 14, 6,500 tanks to our 2,200, 1,950 short-range ballistic missiles to our 0. Okay. According to Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion and a co-founder of the Democratic Party in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev has not carried out a single constitutional reform which has led to dismantling the totalitarian system of the Soviet Union. Well, of course, he's talked about reform, but he hasn't carried out any reforms. Well, the head of the U.S. Communist Party, Gus Hall, last week said, socialism and communism are not dead. They're on a detour. He said political life is something like a garden. Socialism is not an annual. It is a perennial. You can cut it, it will come up again. George Marchais, the head of the French Communist Party, said, "I'm a communist now more than ever." Julio Anguita, the head of Spain's Communist Party, said, "Once a communist, always a communist." Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in an article a couple of weeks ago, you know, there is no foundation for democracy in the Soviet Union because there is no political discipline and there is no feeling of repentance. And this is a key that I'll refer to again. He said during the last 3/4 of a century, the destruction of the souls of the people in the Soviet Union is the most terrifying thing that has ever happened. The fact remains that the KGB, the military, and the Communist Party apparatus and bureaucrats are not simply going to quietly disappear. Well, what about these developments in the words of Russians themselves? This is what some of them say. They say, you can throw away all of these symbols, you can drive the Communist Party underground, but what difference does it make? Just because these people are leaving the Communist Party does not mean we're suddenly living in a democratic country. And one lady put it this way, I'm sure the same people will be running things, they just won't call themselves communist anymore. And of course, most of the political leaders today in the Soviet Union and many East European countries who were communist yesterday or last week or last month or last year are today something else, they say. Socialists, social democrats, whatever, what many of them were in the very beginning, as a matter of fact. So you can change the name and you can change the face, but you cannot change the character of these people. A seminar at the American Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family, and Property put it this way: communism is not dead. It is yet a living danger. It has had over 70 years to learn from its mistakes, and the biggest mistake of all was to go around calling itself communism. That became a stigma in the West, apparently. It's much better to call yourself a socialist, apparently. Ask Bernie Sanders. Kidding. A self-manager or whatever. That's what they said. Anything but that word now, so shed the word. Okay. As you well know, communists still control virtually 1/3 of the face of the earth, either under that name or under their new name, socialist. If you take Albania, Bulgaria, and Romania, they were communists one day, and the next day the communists reformed themselves into socialist or whatever, Salvation Front, or whatever you want to call it. So we want to hope and we want to believe the best always, but there has to be caution, there has to be skepticism, there has to be realism based upon history. The one who is president of the Soviet Union even today, and isn't that amazing according to all that we've heard about how he's been in danger from 1985 right to the present. From the bad guys, the conservatives of all things, right? I mean, I thought conservatives wanted freedom and constitutional republics, and that we were trying to get rid of central governments and repression and totalitarianism. And all of a sudden the media is calling these orthodox communists, big government repressors, they're calling them conservatives. Doesn't that gall you? Well, this one who is still president of the Soviet Union, you know very well, was installed in power by Yuri Andropov, known as the Butcher of Budapest, the one who was slaughtering Hungarians in 1956. He was a KGB chief, and he was the one who said, I like that Gorbachev. He's got a good smile. I think he can, pull it off in terms of projecting this face, this new reform to the people in the West, and they're going to buy it. So Gorbachev was put in to help maintain the communist system. They realized that economically it was falling apart and it did not work, and they knew they didn't have any money to rebuild this thing. So the only place to get the money was from Uncle Sugar, or the ones back in Washington and New York who've been helping all along from the days of Lenin to Gorbachev. You need a few more Arm and Hammers. So this is what they've been doing. The problem with Gorbachev is that he inherited the legacy of the Communist Party of Lenin and Stalin and Brezhnev and Andropov, the Communist Party which killed more people destroyed more churches and imprisoned more Christians than any government in world history. So would you trust the leader of a government system responsible for the deaths of 50% of the clergy in that country, 80% of the churches destroyed in that country, and over 40 million people, according to their own confession or admission, and according to ours, at least 60 million or more. In other words, 1 out of 4 people in the United States. If it took over here, then that means somebody in your family would be gone, would be dead. And you would never forget it. And nobody in your family would ever forget it. Well, that's the legacy of the guy that we're shaking hands with, our president thinks is the salvation for the Russian people, the Soviet people. Nobody there thinks that, but somehow he does. Well, he thought that about Ceausescu, and nobody there thought it. He thinks it about Deng Xiaoping, and nobody there, I'm sure, thinks it either. So Gorbachev's popularity in America is about 75%. Bush, as I understand, has dropped from 80 to 65. But anyway, Gorbachev's is 75. And in the Soviet Union, it's 10% or less, which ought to tell us something. His own people know him. He's the same one who said, I'm a convinced communist, I shall remain one. We are moving toward a new world, the world of communism. We shall never turn off that road, said Gorbachev. He said, don't believe all you hear about glasnost and perestroika and democracy. These are for outward consumption, that is, us fools here in America. There will be no significant change in the Soviet Union other than for cosmetic purposes. Our purpose is to disarm America. What do you know? Bush obliged him last week. Unilateral disarmament. Gorbachev said just a few years ago, this is our purpose, you know. Disarm America and let them fall asleep. He didn't know most of America was already asleep, apparently. In America, where 75% of the people think Gorbachev is good and great, is half asleep or asleep, wouldn't you say? Well, beyond the human deaths and the destroyed churches, the cautionary note that I have to throw out from my firsthand experience on a day-to-day basis of dealing with people from the communist world right up to the last few days. The spiritual damage done to the people is beyond comprehension. Under atheistic Marxist-Leninist bribery, corruption, lying, black marketeering, cheating, learning how not to work, mistrust of one another, these have become a way of life for most people. Most people. Former believers were stripped of their dignity and their self-respect and were forced to sell their souls if they wanted to eat and survive physically. So the legacy of Soviet communism cannot be forgotten. What has kept communism in power all of these years are the unindicted co-conspirators or fellow travelers. If communism were truly dying, if Gorbachev was for real, then why not Nuremberg trials for the convicted murderers? I mean, after all, there were 6 million Jews killed, we understand, by the Nazis, and there were trials held to bring many of the murderers to justice. If there were 60 million, not 6, 60 million Russians or people in the Soviet Union killed, don't you think it would be fair to bring some of these to trial? Alexander Solzhenitsyn, first let me say, there aren't going to be Nuremberg trials for the Soviet communist murderers, and you and I know that, and the reason is the beast isn't dead yet. That's the reason. And its unindicted co-conspirators are still around too. Alexander Solzhenitsyn put it this way in the Gulag Archipelago: for the sake of our country and our children, we have the duty to seek them all out and to bring them all to trial, and to compel each one of them to announce loudly, yes, I was an executioner and a murderer. If communism is truly dying in the Soviet Union, then Gorbachev and other communist leaders should be indicted, convicted, and punished. Richard Wurmbrand, in The Voice of the Martyrs, put it this way, and he was in prisons in communist Romania, as you know. He said, Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin could not kill millions. What does that mean? That means old Uncle Joe and Vladimir couldn't take a gun out there and shoot and kill 1 million people themselves, or 5 million, or 10 million, or 20 million, right? He said they had the help of millions of informers, police officers, henchmen, newspapermen, and authors who justified the killings, poets and clergy who sang the praises of the dictators, people who marched in demonstrations cheering for him, and all of those who voted for him. All of those who voted for him was 99.9%. No wonder Václav Havel said, we're all guilty. We all participated in this. Not all of them are guilty, and I know some who paid the ultimate price. For standing up, they were killed, and others were beaten and jailed for most of their lives. But the overwhelming majority still has this problem of guilt. They did participate, and there were those here in the West, which was even worse, who helped in this charade. So, could anyone really believe that free enterprise, market economics, capitalism, that any of this is going to take hold anytime soon among a population that's been indoctrinated for decade after decade about socialist economics? Isn't it farcical that George Bush recommended to Gorbachev, and Gorbachev has proceeded to enlist the support of Harvard University School, of Kennedy School, which, you know, includes a lot of the former State Department officials, to teach them about free enterprise and market economics. I mean, my understanding is the last place in the United States that anybody would want to go to learn about free enterprise and market economics would be Harvard University. Well, what about the so-called coup that took place in August in the Soviet Union? Well, there was such a gigantic coup and such a people's revolution for democracy that 200 people showed up initially in a city of 10 million. And then gradually, when they got the message, 20,000 turned out of 10 million. Now that's a gigantic demonstration for democratic government, reform, change. Most of the people in the Soviet Union, kind of like most Americans, apathetic. Others were standing in long lines trying to find some food somewhere. So much for people's revolution, for democracy, or whatever. If we believe that a real coup took place, carried out by hardliners, which failed, which is what we're asked to believe, right? If we believe that, then we would have to accept the idea that the heads of the Soviet military and the KGB and the party, ruthless heirs of Lenin, Stalin, Andropov, and the rest, failed to secure the airports, to take control of communications, to take charge of the mass media, to kill Yeltsin and Gorbachev. In other words, all of a sudden, after years of being able to do these things, and of course they did this in communist China just a couple of years ago in Tiananmen Square without any problem. Through all the years of being able to carry these things out rather efficiently, all of a sudden it's amateur night in the Soviet Union. And we would have to believe that many soldiers refused to carry out the orders of their bosses, the so-called leaders of the coup. Well, when for 74 years the soldiers have blindly obeyed their bosses or they have been shot, all of a sudden they have the courage not to obey. Well, even many knowledgeable Soviets have let it slip out that they're aware of the idea and the fact that Gorbachev probably participated in the coup himself and helped plan the coup. In fact, I read 2 days ago that insiders around Gorbachev said Gorbachev is frightened to death about any trial coming up for the so-called coup plotters because he knows he will be implicated. So there may not even be a trial for Yazov and Hugo and the ones that didn't, you know, somehow slit their throats or get their throats slit or whatever. Okay. So, you know, Edward Shevardnadze, who we can't trust, but nevertheless, along with Garry Kasparov, the president of the Georgian Republic, and many Moldavian leaders have all said they were convinced Gorbachev was part of this. I mean, after all, we can look at the bottom line result of what has transpired. And that the bottom line is the virtual re-deification of Yeltsin and Gorbachev. I mean, if your plan was to increase the sympathy of the Americans for Gorbachev so that Gorbachev now could get more aid than he could before from us and Japan and Western Europe, then it worked. Of course, we shouldn't be sending any aid to the communists of the Soviet Union when we have a gigantic deficit that we're handing over to our children. We ought to be talking about deficit reduction. I mean, conservatives in Goldwater's days, for God's sakes, were talking about less government, limited government, lower taxes, reducing spending, balancing budgets. And it's funny that those conservative heirs to the Reagan-Bush years, you don't hear anybody lifting a finger and saying, George Bush, that's the, titular leader of conservatives or whatever you're supposed to be in the Republican Party. We don't hear anybody talking about balancing budgets or reducing deficits or lowering taxes, do we? It's interesting in this regard. After we come back from the break, I want to talk about the Bush foreign policy establishment and name names of individuals that I dealt with who helped boost communist dictators and also who helped line their own pockets financially and increase their own power politically, which apparently they put ahead of our own national interest. And the cases that I've used in the book Betrayal of America, firsthand documents and information from Bush's alliance, not only with Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, but with his successor, who, when I was U.S. ambassador reading top secret intelligence information, the successor projected to the American people as now a Democrat, because after all, everybody in Eastern Europe is free and there's no more communism there, right? So this new Romanian chief, Ion Iliescu, I read the files on him then. He worked with Ceausescu. He was always an Orthodox communist. And from those around him, I mean, there's no question what his objectives and goals are. The secret police has not changed. Most of the agents are still there. Most of the ambassadors and representatives for that country and that regime are still the same ones. So they can change the name, but they haven't changed the reality. And life is still repressive and still despicable. And the same thing is true with regard to the help of this administration for the Communist Chinese and Gorbachev inside the Soviet Union. So thank you. We'll stop for 10 minutes and then come back and talk about the establishment and insiders.
All right, David, you all set? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to sum this up in about maybe 10 or 15 minutes and then open the floor for questions. Communist China shows us a very good example of George Bush carrying out a policy which has neither benefited the American people or the Chinese people, but only the butchers, the communist butchers in China, and the insider elite. Even on 60 Minutes, September 15, 1991, you saw the report of thousands of prison camps, millions of prisoners, and many of them political and religious, engaging in forced slave labor in these prisons, producing goods which are sold in the United States, benefiting from most favored nation treaty status, granted by George Bush every year, preferential treatment. Well, you know, we also have a law that says that we can't grant most favored nation status to countries which engage in slave labor. And yet there it is, you know, contradicting American law. Well, I found this out with regard to communist Romania under Ceausescu. Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which is part of MFN in effect, said that you cannot grant favored preferential trade status to a country which engages in slave labor, number one, or a country which does not carry out the practice of free immigration. And Ceausescu was selling hundreds of thousands of ethnic Germans from Romania to the Federal Republic of Germany in an under-the-table deal, but the American government was aware of it. I was aware of it. And Ceausescu was selling hundreds of thousands of ethnic Jews from Romania to the State of Israel for about $12,000 to $14,000 per head. So we've been granting favored treatment to various communist dictators contrary to American law. When the Chinese communists rolled the tanks into Beijing and instituted martial law, 11 days later, George Bush gave them the green light to go ahead and shoot and kill by granting most favored nation status to the Communist Chinese. This is what all of these cases have in common, which I put in betrayal of America. It was only a few days after George Bush said, we're going to renew most favored nation treaty status for Communist China, that the tanks then opened fire and slaughtered the students in Tiananmen Square. Well, when Gorbachev and the Soviet communists sent tanks and paratroopers and black berets into the Baltic capitals and killed freedom fighters, George Bush appeased and rewarded Gorbachev and the Soviets by again promising most favored nation status for Moscow. In fact, in the words of Landsbergis of Lithuania, he said this policy of George Bush is a policy that smacks of Munich. It's a policy of appeasement. In every case, he gave the green light to them to go ahead and to repress the people. When I was living in communist Romania, Romania's monster killed thousands of innocent people, destroyed churches, and did many other horrible things that you've heard about. Bush appeased him by praising him and by recommending continued most favored nation status, continued financial assistance to communist Romania. What the major media hasn't shown us in the wake of the execution of the Ceausescus in December of 1989 is that from 1974 and 5 to 1988, the United States government was granting MFN to Ceausescu. And these billions of dollars in credits, reduced rate loans, which I can't even get. I'm an American citizen, I'm not a communist, okay? I have a son who just went to college, I have a daughter who's getting ready to go to college. I cannot get a reduced rate loan for my children to go to college in this country of America, but communist dictators named Ceausescu, Deng Xiaoping, and Gorbachev can get reduced rate loans at American taxpayers' expense. It doesn't seem to make any sense, does it? So those people I found out, and the ones I came into contact with, from Managua to Vilnius, from Beijing to Bucharest, have all been sorely disappointed and appalled at the appeasement policy of our president, our administration, and our State Department. Well, who runs the American foreign policy? You have a revolving door elite, which usually follows a certain track. And the track goes something like this: from universities or the major news media to the government, usually the State Department, from the State Department to the Council on Foreign Relations, from there to think tanks or to foundations, and then maybe vice versa. Cases: Lawrence Eagleburger, State Department, became a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Then he was chairman of Kissinger Associates consulting firm, you know, made $1 million a year from 1985 to 1989, roughly. And now he's back in the State Department. And Lawrence Eagleburger, who threatened and warned me almost every day that I was in the job, who said that I wasn't kissing Ceausescu and that was our policy. We should be, you know, hugging this dictator. Eagleburger was appointed U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia by Jimmy Carter. So isn't it, you know, understandable that the conservative George Bush would appoint him to run his foreign policy as deputy secretary? Democrat, Republican, not a big difference there, right? Call yourself conservative, call yourself liberal, not a big difference, apparently. Right. This is what was going on. Richard Burt at that time was working for the New York Times, leaking intelligence information on the front pages of the New York Times. He got rewarded for that and was appointed Assistant Secretary of State in the State Department, then ambassador to West Germany, and finally head of START talks. So you know what's been happening with the START talks. God help us, you know, with his Richard Burton. Zbigniew Brzezinski went from the university to the government, naturally State Department, to membership on the Council on Foreign Relations, to the foundations and think tanks, and I'm sure he'll go back into government again probably. He certainly, all of these characters go on Nightline, they go on the major news programs that, you know, we can't get on, but they can get on these things. I was called by Nightline twice, and in the wake of the execution of Ceausescu and the so-called revolution in Romania, and then somehow each time I got canceled out, never wound up being on there. So Ted Koppel eventually sent a crew down, a camera crew, and filmed me for over an hour, and they showed 15 seconds, which they selected out, you know, whatever they want to show there. But that's about the extent of the major, you know, media exposures. So Gene Kirkpatrick went from the university to the State Department to the Council on Foreign Relations to think tanks or foundations. Henry Kissinger from the university to the State Department to the Council to his own Kissinger Associates, think tanks, professorship, whatever. You know, by going this route, you can get big fees for speaking, big fees for writing. You can write in, you know, major publications. World Foreign Affairs pays pretty big, I understand. So do Mooney publications, The World and I, or Insight, or those. How did we miss out? I'm just kidding. Also, more recently, of course, you've got the Arm & Hammer with a Texas accent. Robert Strauss was appointed by George Bush to be U.S. ambassador to Moscow. Well, that's appropriate. After all, liberal Democrat being appointed by, you know, conservative Republican, first of all. And secondly, he has investments and stock in Martin Marietta, which is one of the companies that makes the most money off of dealing with the communists in the Soviet Union. So no conflict of interest there to send Bob Strauss to Moscow, any more than it was Lawrence Eagleburger to be running our foreign policy, or to go over and click glasses with Deng Xiaoping in the wake of Tiananmen Square, along with Brent Scowcroft, who I should have mentioned was vice chairman of Kissinger Associates, making himself about $500,000 a year. And Larry Eagleburger, I know, even the New York Times reported this, was on the board of directors of several communist banks in Yugoslavia. He spent most of his time in Kissinger Associates, as did Scowcroft, two of the principal architects of Bush's foreign policy, wiring deals between communist governments, monopolies, and corporations, businesses, and banks in the United States. So it all seems to make sense there. Of course, in terms of the 400 plus banks, businesses, and corporations in America who do business with Communist China, and thus find it in their interest to demonstrate for continued favored nation status and not worry about America's interest or the interest of the people suffering in China. Included in that group is Prescott Bush, brother of George, who has investments in Communist China. Bush has spent a lifetime surrounding himself with those people who believe in one world government. And we can just single out a few, those in the State Department, Eagleburger and Baker, in the NSC, Scowcroft, in big business and banking circles, Mosbacher, Schultz, and Rockefeller, in politics, Thornburg and Baker. Baker wants to be president, by the way. And so, you know, that's why he's a PR frontman for the State Department, while Larry Eagleburger, who knows all the skeletons of where everybody is in the department, has been running it. And, you know, and speaking of the threats, he sent me a cable one day that said, "Eyes only for Ambassador Funderburk. What in the H are you trying to do? You know, rock the boat? Upset this cozy relationship that we have with this nice guy. This is our communist. I mean, he's our boy, Ceausescu." So he said, "Apparently you don't understand what our foreign policy is. And I don't want to hear any more reports from you dealing with human rights violations, murders of pastors and priests, destruction of churches, or this technology transfer question. You know, let's just not raise this anymore, this type of thing." And so this is what I was getting from Washington. And of course, they were circumventing me anyway and running policy into Bucharest directly to Ceausescu through the big bankers and businessmen and Eagleburger, or some of the other officials who came over there, for that matter. Bush's main appointments at the State Department and the NSC have invariably been compromisers and one-worlders in their views, or convergence theory believers, however you want to describe it. The main appointees of George Bush have been those who prefer to maintain the status quo, who have supported communists or socialists, if you will, and who will help him promote his New World Order. And we could call this the Nixon, Kissinger, Carter, Ford, Bush, or we could call it Rockefeller, Eagleburger, Scowcroft foreign policy. You know, all of these together doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference. As one of his first acts as U.S. President, about a month after he was inaugurated, as you know, George Bush pardoned not Ollie North, whether he deserved it or not, but he pardoned the one man, the multimillionaire, who has been the closest friend of every communist dictator in Moscow from Lenin to Gorbachev, Armand Hammer, whose father was co-founder of the U.S. Communist Party. The fact that this was considered important to George Bush should tell us something about what his priorities are, unfortunately. When I sent in information, again, you know, about the deaths and the terror and the horror going on in Romania, when I debated and opposed the transfer of technology and also granting a most favored nation status and aid to communist Romania, I was circumvented or undercut or threatened, you know, almost in every case, The major media in the United States did not cover Ceausescu's atrocities. And so, therefore, to most Americans, they weren't existing. But you see, this has been going on around the world. Did they cover the atrocities of Mao Zedong? Did they cover the atrocities of Stalin or Brezhnev or Andropov? Of course not. These have not been covered, so the average American doesn't understand that so many people have been killed inside the communist world. I mean, there was one person in the Soviet Union recently who said, he was demonstrating for freedom, and he said, you know, when they all have to go to the pearly gates, when Americans and people in the West have to face death and the hereafter, they would all be condemned to hell for what they did, except for two people. And I'm not saying these are the two best people, but I'm just at all, because one of them is not, as a matter of fact. But what it points out is that the communists inside the Soviet Union and the Democrats inside the Soviet Union didn't know of anybody in the West who understood the reality or who was trying to help them, as opposed to trying to help the communists. So this guy said, the only people we ever heard through all these years who said anything were George Orwell and Robert Conquest. Maybe that's because somebody smuggled in some things that they wrote in which they described Big Brother or Animal Farm 1984 or totalitarian horror that was going on. Of course, this was cataloged by people inside the Soviet Union who, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but Robert Conquest, who wrote books about terror, and Orwell, who was a socialist himself, as you know, were people who were writing some of this stuff from the West. The sad thing to me is that no names from America were mentioned. See, they weren't aware of too many of us and what we were trying to do. Most recently, at the United Nations in New York City, in fact, Monday, a week ago, George Bush said he thought the United Nations should encourage worldwide standards for values and beliefs. And then he went on to say, you know, as of today, that was Monday week, there are 166 nations in the UN. And I thought, yes, of those 166, most are socialist, most are radical, most are atheist, and most are anti-American, and most vote against the United States. And we want to get in bed with this majority of atheists, anti-American, socialist, radicals, and share values, and take their values, and let that be the standard, and let that be the values for us. Bush said our quest for a new world order last week, rule of law, cooperative settlement of disputes, belief in human rights, and that America's role in the New World Order would be to favor, he said, not isolationism, that's not what we want, and not a Pax Americana, of America being the only superpower, but what we want is a Pax Universalis. We want a universal, you know, organization and world and peace. And it was almost as if he had been listening to us and hearing what you have to say and the New American has to say and John Birch Society has to say when Bush said, you know, don't be worried this New World Order I'm talking about does not diminish American sovereignty. That's what he said last week. Well, you know, that's not possible to have a New World Order using the United Nations as its major vehicle and for America's national sovereignty not to be diminished. I mean, that is the nature. And it's also, it's interesting that the United Nations treaties and conventions require the end of national independence. Some constitutional scholars have put it this way: UN treaties demand that the U.S. alter its laws to suit the demands of a foreign political body, the UN, and that's exactly right. It's important to note in the comments of Yevgeny Primakov, and I've just noticed that in the last few days he was appointed as the head of disinformation in the KGB. And he was the head of the International Relations Institute in the Soviet Union, Marxist studies and this type of stuff. Yevgeny Primakov said, well, what Bush has said about the New World Order and what Gorbachev believes about the New World Order are identical. Isn't it interesting that Primakov would say this? And he went on to say that, of course, the Persian Gulf conflict, or whatever you want to call it, you know, we could call it the war to make the Persian Gulf safe for George's oil mogul friends, or to make the Persian Gulf safe for the rich Arabs, or the, you know, to rescue the rich Arabs, the emirs of Kuwait and sheiks of Saudi Arabia. We could even go back and say, you know, there's a little tidbit there that's kind of curious. When George Bush was drilling for oil with his daddy's money in Midland, Texas, you know, where I've been, I used to live in West Texas as well, and most of the people I know in Midland, Texas understand George Bush very well. And when he was drilling for oil there, he set up a company called Zapata Oil Company. It just happened to be the first one to drill offshore Kuwait in the 50s. And from that time until the present, there's been a little sentimentality, a little connection between George and his friends, the rich Arabs of Kuwait. This New World Order of one world government, or world unification, values and standards of the UN, or whatever we want to call it, we do know is not going to benefit the average patriotic taxpayer in America as much as it's going to benefit the powerful insiders in the United States and also the communist bosses in Moscow. So when Bush and Gorbachev sit down together and they talk about shared values and shared goals, they are not talking about the preservation of the distinctive American way of life, which to me means belief in God, family, the individual worth and dignity of every human being, private property, the representative constitutional republic. So what you would have would be an atheistic, Marxist-Leninist, secularistic boss in Moscow sitting down with the American insider leadership, making decisions behind closed doors which affect the whole world. And that's scarcely the way to preserve America's principles or America's values. So we can call them the insiders, the establishment, the CFR, trilateralist, or whatever. A big question is, why is it that they always seem to put their own financial and political power interest ahead of America's interest? Why is it they always prefer to do business with monopoly communists instead of one time, just once, let us know when they have stood and they have advocated the overthrow of the communists in Beijing and Moscow and Bucharest and the other places. Just once. When have they joined with those seeking freedom from communism and advocated the overthrow of any of those communists? Not once. So it is unfortunately consistent for George Bush of Andover, Yale, Skull and Bones, the Council on Foreign Relations, and all of the other great jobs that he served in, the high government posts in the United States. It is consistent for him to praise the communist boss, Ceausescu, to continue supporting the communist butchers of Beijing, Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng, to continue to praise and support Mikhail Gorbachev, hated by most of the people inside the Soviet Union. It is consistent for the elitist Bush to pardon Arm & Hammer, to favor taxing middle-income Americans, but not the people in his class, not his friends, not Baker, not Mosbacher, not Rockefeller, not Kissinger. Okay. It is consistent for him to appoint a Rockefeller-Kissinger foreign policy. I don't have to tell you about the danger of socialism in this country. I mean, you live in what some have called the Socialist Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And let me tell you that that Socialist Commonwealth is not far behind for the rest of us in the South or the West or other parts of the country. We all know, as Robert Welch put it, that there is a worldwide battle going on between freedom and slavery, between light and darkness. And we know it is not just the people running the communist system who are the problem. And we know we cannot put faith in politicians in Washington. I mean, I'm hoping that Bob's going to, help us in this and get beyond Boston to Washington and help clean house like Larry McDonald could have done if he had still been there. Money and power, unfortunately, have corrupted most of the people in Washington, and courage is lacking, without any question. So I think we have to keep our aim focused on the big picture of what the external threat is and what the internal threat is. And we have to put forward an alternative, a positive program, which is our faith, the freedom that we stand for, our country, our families, these values, more responsibility, and a sense of duty. Nobody ever said this job was going to be easy, and nobody ever said we weren't going to have to pay a price for what we believe and what we stand for. I encourage those of you who aren't to work with America's most effective pro-American and anti-communist organization, the John Birch Society. Help in this task before it's too late of saving America and our freedoms and our traditional values and principles. It takes time, it takes money, it takes effort, it takes energy. But what choice do we have? We have to do this. I gave up a job of prestige and money to try to help get out the truth, because there is a higher calling to me than just power and money. And my father was a pastor, and he handed me a Bible in which he underlined the passage Luke 12:48, which says, "Everyone to whom much is given, of him will much be required." And that is you and that is me. We've really been given more. We've been blessed more than most people on this planet. We've also been given more in terms of the true information and the truth. That's the mission, the education of the American people. So there's still a lot of things we can do and must do. I appreciate you coming tonight. Keep the faith. God bless you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're very kind. I'll be glad to try to answer any questions that you have for a few minutes. Yes, sir.
Could you tell us a little bit about what happened in Romania leading up to the overthrow of Ceausescu and how it stands now? And I'd like to know where I can find out more about the edition as far as resources.
Okay, there are several people. There's certainly a lot of ethnic newspapers and magazines in the United States which write almost on a daily basis the reality of what has happened inside of Romania since the so-called coup bringing about democracy and reforms inside of Romania. What most people think happened, and this includes a former head of the Securitate or the KGB inside of Romania, was that you had demonstrations which were staged in opposition to Ceausescu so that he could be replaced. In fact, this is what happened throughout Eastern Europe. I mean, it's been documented and spelled out very well inside the New American Magazine. That, you know, on one day, just miraculously, here were hardline communists, and then on the next day, you had reformers in. And usually, it was right after a visit from Gorbachev. Within a week or within days of a visit by Gorbachev, they all got the signal, and they all moved aside. Ceausescu was an egomaniac. and he wasn't necessarily going to take orders from anybody. But at any rate, Gorbachev saw to it that Ceausescu was removed because he was projecting a terrible image to the United States and the West, even though most of it hadn't gotten out, but some of it had. And so he placed in power the one stepping into power, and it was all very interesting because we heard the stories about how the secret police and the military were fighting each other, you know, the good guys and the bad guys in Bucharest. Well, there was Ion Iliescu, a successor to Ceausescu, who worked with Ceausescu, standing there in the lights, under the lights for hours and hours, and all these shots were supposed to be going by, and no shot ever got him. This is just unbelievable. Why was that? Well, Ion Iliescu had studied for 3 or 4 years at the University of Moscow with Gorbachev, where he was president of foreign students while Gorbachev was president of the Russian students. And they became close friends and collaborators there. And this is what every Romanian knows. And so you have in office today a Gorbachev protege and a continuation of the communist system under another name. So this ought to show pretty much what has happened in other parts of Eastern Europe now. You know that Iliescu used miners who, in fact, about a decade and a half ago, many miners demonstrated against Ceausescu for more money and improved working conditions. Ceausescu flew in personally with a helicopter and with KGB troops and shot and killed thousands of them, which is never reported in the West. And then for the future, he planted thousands of KGB agents among the miners. So that, you know, it's no surprise to find the miners being trained into Bucharest by Iliescu to beat anti-communist demonstrators. Now, last week, miners came into Bucharest on trains, and nobody knows, you know, where they came from. It was interesting to me that their major demand was the removal of the premier. Well, that's like going to Washington and calling for the removal of Dan Quayle. Petre Roman then stepped down, conveniently. Ion Iliescu, Gorbachev's man, is still there. Mikhail Gorbachev is still there. So, does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, I guess.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Ambassador, could you make a few comments regarding the Gorbachev's policy on manipulation of religious systems in the Soviet Union and the Perestroika and the Glasnost?
Right. From every report that I've seen, you've had a continuation of the KGB operating in all of the churches and religious groups inside the Soviet Union, as it always has in the past. I mean, to the point that even some reports have shown what those of us who were reading top secret intelligence information knew a long time ago, which was that there were many priests in the Orthodox Church and in other churches who were members of the Communist Party, planted there by the KGB to monitor and direct the activities of the churches to make sure that they never condemned or criticized the communist bosses in those countries, so that when these religious heads would go to the World Council of Churches meetings, as the Orthodox did, and some of the others, there you would never find them saying or admitting that there were any murders, any destruction of churches, or any problems for religion inside of those countries. The change that you have today in the East European countries and the Soviet Union to some degree is that as part of the reform face that they're projecting to show that they have transformed themselves in order to get our aid, they have opened the society to American visitors to a greater extent, also for immigration from the country. So Americans can go over there with Bibles today, and they couldn't always do that in the past. So in that sense, there is a window of opportunity, you know, for us to go in there, even though it's probably going to be closed. And it's only, you know, certainly that's going to have a long-term effect, because everything is going to be long-term there. If anything changes, it's going to require the education of a generation or two. So that's why, if we had to predict what the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe are going to look like, whether communism is dead or not dead, or socialism is dead or not dead, you're going to have 2 generations to contend with, 20, 30, 40 more years of problems and chaos and shocks to the American people, you know, that, well, things aren't what we thought they were initially, you know, here. But that hasn't changed in that regard. I mean, there is a little more freer ability for people to go to churches right now, you know, and not pay quite the price they paid before. But I have to stress the fact that most churches don't exist anymore either. An example, before the Bolsheviks took over the Soviet Union, about 90 to 95% of people were practicing Christians. Today it's about 12%. So that's what kind of job they've done. And if you go to major cities in Siberia, you don't find churches. If you go to St. Petersburg, which was Leningrad, there were 500 churches, Orthodox churches, before the revolution. There are 15 today. All the reports we get show churches filled with people in Moscow, a Baptist church in Moscow or a Catholic church or an Orthodox church or whatever. Well, they're the exception to the rule. And of course, they don't show the overwhelming reality. How do you bring back all the clergy killed? You know? Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier you were going to say something about repentance. What did you have in mind?
Well, what I was talking about, which I didn't use the exact word when I came back, but it was referring to the fact that the people in the Soviet Union all collaborated, with just a few exceptions, you know, with the communists in one way or another to varying degrees. And in that sense, most of them have not confronted themselves with that factor, which is one explanation and reason for their sense of depression and sense of self-denigration, which is really hampering any type of development in those countries. In other words, the overwhelming majority of the people in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe helped the communist regimes stay in power. And by doing that, they committed crimes, and they haven't repented for those crimes. And of course, those in America who helped them have not either. Which, you know, I should say repentance should come here, you know, first in that regard. Let me go up here for a moment. Yes, sir.
2 points I was going to ask you about. One is the well-planned dope infiltration in the United States, you know, going from 45, 50 years ago. And the second one is I read in Defense News, which is a publication I subscribe to, from Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Virginia. They're trying to build submarines like no tomorrow. They also have a program of building a miniature submarine, 1/3 the size and 1/10 the cost, which will have about 20 people, of manning the submarine rather than 500 or 300, you know.
Right.
So this is an ongoing program. Millions and billions are being spent in that, which they will supply the miniature submarines to the third world countries or their satellites. And I'm just touching on it. This is supposed to be going on right now.
Right.
To encircle the United States for nuclear blackmail. That's what I'm talking about.
Right. I think that's accurate. You know, I looked in various newspapers and magazines in the last few days to see if anybody had the courage enough to slip in a warning and a caution about Bush's announcements of unilateral disarmament. And there were only a few very quiet voices. Richard Pearl, for example, said, "I think it's a tremendous gamble on Bush's part to be doing this." And General Galvin and a couple of others said that this doesn't make any sense and this is almost insanity for George Bush to be doing this.
Why would he even be allowed to even say it?
Yeah. Well, obviously not, you know, it really didn't hit the front pages anywhere. It was buried. But in terms of the drugs, there is no question, I think it needs to be emphasized, that the communist governments have been engaged in drug running and ensuring that drugs get into the United States. And of course, we've got most of them. And they come in here, and you see what they're doing in our cities and to our population and our public schools and everything else. I mean, it's unbelievable. And it was interesting that I was reading intelligence information every day showing that Ceausescu was running drugs from here from his country to the West, and the United States government denied it. And yet it was right there in black and white print. We were picking it up, and yet they said it wasn't happening. And he was also training radical terrorists, and that wasn't supposed to be happening. I mean, some of the leading international terrorists in the world at that time would come in and out of that country, as well as East Germany and Hungary and some others, where he was harbored, protected, and given safe haven before he went off on another mission. And so this is what they have been doing, and Interestingly enough, they've continued to do it. So the secret police organizations and their connections with the KGB, those in Eastern Europe and the KGB Soviet connection, are still there. And so if communism were dead, then this would have been destroyed and we would have all the files, but it hasn't happened. Yes?
Dr. Funderburk, could you repeat that quotation you mentioned before from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whereas democracy would never come about in the Soviet Union because there is no...
He said there's no political discipline. This was the first thing he said. And he said there's no... I can read the whole quote if you like.
If you could, and would you...
Okay, but it's from the Gulag Archipelago, the 3-volume thing, which goes on for thousands of pages that he had. Did you have another question?
I was curious about your own feeling on that. Do you feel that to be on target?
Which part?
The part about democracy not taking hold of the Soviet Union.
Well, I've been debating for the last year and a half a former Russian KGB agent. I'll put the emphasis on former, questionable. Okay? At any rate, we've talked about this a lot. Vladimir Sakharov. I've talked with him and a lot of others, and they swear that Russians don't want democracy because they don't know anything about democracy. And of course, as a historian, there have only been a few precious moments in the history of that country, maybe from February to October, or March to November, whatever calendar you use in 1917, when you had just the beginnings and just the possibility of elementary, rudimentary democratic type of government. And a few months and hundreds of years of history is not very much. But that's not to say that every human being wouldn't want to be free from being shackled by a central government and repression, if they knew. But the fact, what we're confronted with right now, until the people can be re-educated, is that they have been indoctrinated. And they have been living under a system in which it became easier for most people not to work, and for most people to be protected in some collective environment. So we got a lot of families out from Romania and Eastern Europe, brought them over here. Some of them lived with us, and they could not cope. I mean, many do come over here and they do very well, but others could not make decisions of buying an apartment or looking for a job, and not having the state tell them what to do in terms of decision making. And so it really has been ingrained and indoctrinated among a lot of people. And of course, in addition to that, there were 20 to 40 million people who got some perks and benefits from the system and lived fairly well, while everybody else was living, in pretty bad straits. So that was the system. I can't find the quote right now, but I'll keep looking for it. Okay, sorry.
Doctor, I want to ask you on this Nadia Comaneci. She fled the country because she was a friend of Ceausescu.
Nicu Ceausescu.
Yeah. She's supposed to be on the TV or something. I didn't hear nothing about it. Can you tell me, what happened? Maybe she was shut up or something?
Well, it's amazing that she got out of the country just months before Ceausescu, was executed, because as great an athlete as she may have been during all the years when I was there and she was there, everything she did was to the benefit of Ceausescu and the communist regime. Everything. She never spoke out. She never said a word. She was used by them the whole time. And then she comes out, 100 pounds heavier later. I shouldn't say that, but at any rate, she comes out to the West. She comes out to the West with a man who already has a wife. And she's living with a man who already has a wife in Florida, a carpenter from Romania, And the media saw this and they said, well, that's not quite the darling, innocent Nadia Comaneci that we knew before. And so there wasn't too much about it then, until finally she went on some talk show programs and they said, well, how can you be with this slimy character who's already married to somebody? And you're over here, you're trying to make money, and you're trying to say you're opposed to communism, when of course you were dating Ceausescu's son, you know, in Romania. Okay, so eventually she dumps this guy. She's convinced by some of her handlers to dump him, and she goes to Canada. And now she's in Canada trying to refurbish her image so that she can make some money by telling her story and having a film made about her life. And so I imagine Hollywood will do the deal for her eventually, even despite all of these things that she's done. And she'll be presented to us again as a great and wonderful child persecuted by a terrible Ceausescu system. But let me tell you, it wasn't that way.
I want to know, how do you get speaking engagements? Is there any other organization besides the John Birch Society that sponsors you? How are we going to get your message out to the American public?
How do I get them? With difficulty, other than through the John Birch Society. There have been a few groups, minor with limited audiences. For example, Intercollegiate Studies Institute. It's supposed to be conservative college groups, and accuracy in academia and accuracy in media. There is a group of conservative Catholics headed by Eleanor Schlafly, sister-in-law of Phyllis, Cardinal Manzini Foundation, and I've spoken some for them, but the John Birch Society has been the major one. I mean, an average college or university, if they know what I'm saying or where I've come from, they would never invite me to speak, of course.
Are you a John Birch?
Or a civic group as well. I consider myself a close friend and ally and supporter of the John Birch Society, and I have been speaking for 2 years for the society. Right. Thank you.
Yeah, right.
Yes, sir.
The book, New Lies for Old, you didn't mention that. I wonder what you thought of it.
I like New Lies for Old by Anatoly Golitsyn because all those years when I was in Romania, I saw that this so-called independence of Ceausescu was not real. And that's the only book I could ever find that substantiated that. And he also talked about the lack of reality of the Chinese-Soviet split, the Albanian split, the Yugoslav split, as well as the Romanian one. And you know more recently what the FBI and the CIA have said and done with regard to Anatoly Golitsyn. And they tried to discredit him throughout, which tells me something as well. But it's been a valuable book, and I think a lot of what he said is really remarkable and amazing. You know, in the last chapter of that book, he forecasts a lot of things that have been taking place in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and this was probably 20 years ago when he wrote it. It was printed in 1984. And then you also have a book which is Red Horizons, written by a former chief of the secret police of Romania, Jan Mihai Pacepa. And I've talked to him. He's living underground in the United States, but it's very interesting that Pacepa said, you know, I sat down with this Ceausescu. I was his chief, the head of the KGB, and he said, we sat down and Ceausescu said, let's formulate a policy. Let's call it glasnost. Let's call it Ceausescu's glasnost. And let's project it to the United States so that they will think we're reforming, and we'll say a few words about reform, you know, continue to do our jobs, our duty, what we've been doing. And then we'll get money from them. And it worked to perfection. He said, we did that. The U.S. bought it, and they gave us the money. It worked. So, I mean, if it worked for Ceausescu and it worked for Deng Xiaoping, why shouldn't it work for Mikhail Gorbachev? Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to preface my question with one or two remarks. Just about 5 days after the so-called coup in Moscow, I went and called into one of the talk shows on one of the Boston stations here, and I told him, I said, if anybody with half a mind would know that this whole thing that took place in Moscow this last week had to be staged for the benefit of people like you that are on radio stations. And and 2 seconds later, over the radio came the music from what used to be a program called The Twilight Zone. And I like to ask you, how do you deal with radio stations that keep doing this sort of thing to us when we're trying to get a message across?
Well, that's a good question, and it also brings up the fact that that I should have mentioned, well, what do we do? Well, of course, the John Birch Society, as you know, is an educational organization that's trying to get out as much information as possible, using as many avenues as possible, and sometimes they're radio stations and cable television, and sometimes they're local newspapers and videos, and in various ways that we can try to get the message out. You know, the mainstream, the establishment media is not going to listen to us, or is not going to give us the time of day unless they try to sabotage our message. So that, you know, even though it's going on radio stations in Western Mass and Connecticut yesterday, and one way they do it is that I'm talking about the Soviet duplicity and deception and insider collaboration, and they're talking about, they want me to talk about the Middle East.
Yeah, right.
And the situation with Bush and Lone right now, and also about South Africa, which is, you know, it's fine to talk about that, but they always conveniently shift the subject. I don't know, other than to get the attention of those who own the station, those who are on the board, or those who have stock in the station. I suppose if you had enough people in the district, you could demonstrate or could buy into it and get their attention, or have people en masse to call in, or call the managers of the station, and, you know, demand a little bit more fair play. These are some things that we can do in the same sense that we need a Larry McDonald or two in the Congress to get the attention of the American people that most of our congressmen are voting for MFN, for Communist China, for Communist Romania, for Mikhail Gorbachev, and that to expose the financial interest and conflicts of interest that people like Eagleburger and Scowcroft and Prescott Bush and so forth have. I mean, we've got to get the message out, and you have to get the attention of the people in the country and the office holders that we put in office. And, you know, we can demonstrate, we have a tremendous asset in this country, as a matter of fact, that we don't utilize very much. And that is the millions of people who have come here from communist lands. And they know the reality of what has been going on inside communist countries, and they know that when they were sitting there in jail, they were talking and dreaming and hoping that General MacArthur or somebody from America was going to come in there with a tank or an airplane and rescue them, because that's what we led them to believe. And of course we never came. And so if we could let them be our allies to give us more credibility by simply saying, well, I was there, and that is the way it is, and what you're saying is valid, and what you're saying is accurate. And I know the obstacles are great, because I'm well aware, having gone to Catholic, Orthodox, Baptist, and Pentecostal churches of Hungarian and Romanians and other ethnic groups in this country, that the churches and the groups in this country are infiltrated by the KGB from their countries, to the point that many of those who have come here are intimidated. First of all, they grew up in a land where you don't question a leader of a country. So they come here and they know this, but who would they feel like they are to question George Bush, first of all? And then secondly, are they going to speak out against communism back home if they have a family member still there? And if they're intimidated by the KGB agent next to them inside of there. So this creates quite a problem. I mean, it was unbelievable to me that this can be happening in America. When I ran for the United States Senate, subsequent to that, several people who have defected from communist Romania and from the secret police and the highest levels of the foreign ministry and intelligence ministry said that when I was running in a primary for the United States Senate, that Ceausescu put the word out through his Securitate agency that at all costs make sure that Funderburk doesn't win the election. Well, he needn't have worried, because there were internal forces that were making sure that I wasn't going to win either. But at any rate, he he told me specifically that Ceausescu sent agents right into my home state and planted stories in the major newspapers, and also to my opponent, gave information to my opponent which they had fabricated and made up for use in this campaign. The fact that they could do that when, at that time, it was illegal for members of the embassies of the Warsaw Pact to travel more than 50 or 100 miles outside of Washington, D.C. But they're all over the country in various ways. It's just amazing what goes on. I mean, this doesn't all happen by accident, does it?
I'm afraid we've run out of time. Could you make this the last one?
Okay, one more question back there.
Would you address a couple of comments about your trip down the road to Damascus? Having been chosen for an ambassadorship, I assume that you had all the proper credentials. Ultimately, matriculated into the CFR. What is it that...
I don't know about that. I never heard from him, actually.
Well, it would have taken time if you'd done pay your dues. What is it that caused you to see the reality?
Well, I believe in God, and I suppose I have to say I have a conscience. And we lived with a family, again, which I stated initially, that had been beaten into submission. And it bothered me every day. I couldn't run away from that reality that we saw and we were told. We have a concern for the people who were suffering there, and also a shame for the fact that it was American leaders who were helping keep them in that position. So I should say that, you know, the route for me getting in there was purely accidental, the way I would see it, because sure, I had a Fulbright scholarship, but it wasn't easy even to get that, because when I went for the interviews, they were used to giving Fulbright fellowships to people from the Ivy League who had certain points of view. And at that point, they didn't know what my views were. You know, but they knew I wasn't from the Ivy League, so it was probably a risk of some sort. But the accidental part, I would say, was, you know, in 1980, you had the election of Ronald Reagan, and then you had a Republican majority for one of the brief periods, Republican majority in the U.S. Senate for a very brief period there in the last 40-something years. And after Reagan's election, there were a lot of U.S. senators and other groups which had helped elect him through financial support. I mean, PAC support, you know, millions of dollars had gone into Reagan's campaign, and it helped him win the election in certain states. So 7 senators collectively endorsed my nomination for something in the Reagan administration, foreign policy. And my name was put up. Alexander Haig was Secretary of State. He opposed it. He was representing the State Department and the career diplomats. They didn't want me at all. And my name was put up initially to be head of the East European Department in the State Department. And it was 6 or 8 months later, I got a telephone call from White House personnel saying, these jobs are reserved for the career diplomats. You can't have it, but why don't you put your name in for U.S. Ambassador to Romania, because you lived there 4 times previously. You know the language, you wrote a doctoral thesis about it, so you seem to have some qualifications on it. And we don't think you'll get it because you're too young, but they said it might get your name around. So there were some senators who carried my name into the White House to Bill Clark and to Ronald Reagan and said, you know, we helped elect you, and we would like to put him and 8 or 10 other people in a few positions here and there. So I think they decided that we can tolerate a few people in some peripheral positions, and we can isolate them and keep them from, you know, doing any real damage. So there might have been, out of 150 ambassadors, there might have been 10 or 15 who were of a like mind, appointed initially to places, in all cases except mine, to non-sensitive positions. I mean, you know, if you go to Luxembourg, you're not going to do much good or damage one way or the other. But Romania was kind of an exception in that regard, but that was pretty much how that worked out. They knew that I wasn't one of them, and like Clarence Thomas today, who may not be one of us, nevertheless, I paid a price pretty much like Clarence Thomas at the Senate Foreign Relations hearings, from Edward Kennedy, from Joe Biden, from Alan Cranston, and Paul Tsongas. I had to go into Paul Tsongas' office, and he said, you don't want to sit you do not want to sit on this couch. That's where Ernest Lefevre sat just before I shot down his nomination. And Tsongas was telling me, well, I'm sorry you feel this way. I don't understand how you came to these conclusions. And he said, I kind of thought that maybe our views were closer in terms of the Soviet Union. He said, you might find my views, you know, pretty similar to yours. I mean, I don't like the Soviets. I mean, I don't like communists. That's in essence what he was saying. So he had a book that he had written, Looking Homeward or something, I don't know. He wrote in there and he said, hoping that someday you will see the light. Here it is. But they held up my nomination. I had written a book previously about misteaching of communism in American universities. In the Senate Foreign Relations hearings, initially, some of those senators at Reagan's behest got up there and they said, well, you know, he's been to the country, knows the language. My God, that's better than most people we send as ambassadors, so I don't see any problem, let him go. And they said, okay, it's fine. So I left, went home, I thought everything was okay. No, Biden and Kennedy found out about the book. See? And some media person gave them this previous book, which wasn't openly published or anything. And so they brought it in there and they read it page for page, word for word, and they said, do you retract this statement? Do you deny, you know, will you withdraw this statement? I mean, why did you say things like this about the major media, about America's universities, and about Billy Graham, among other things? So there was a little price there even in the beginning, and they put me in there, and obviously I didn't have much of an impact on the policy. We were able to hold up high technology transfer because I had a few allies in the Defense Intelligence Agency, but in terms of human rights abuses and most favored nation status and things of that nature, you know, it didn't work out. But I just wanted to give you a picture of how that worked. Yes, sir. Thank you.
I'd like to call upon Richard Johnson to close us in prayer. Pastor Richard Johnson.
Let's just take a moment to ask our Heavenly Father's guidance for these challenging days in which we live. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for the precious men and women who purchased freedoms for us at the beginnings of this great country of ours, with their lives, with their efforts, with their blood. We ask you, Father, to raise up again a godly remnant of men and women who will come up against the forces of evil and regain and maintain our political, our economic, and our religious freedoms. Help us, Father. Give us wisdom. Give us strength. Give us grace to do what is right in these challenging days in which we live. We ask in the name of our Lord and Savior. Amen.
Amen.